I asked a man who has kept bees for 70 years what he does differently than everyone else, expecting a technique, a special feeding method, a secret plant, some old trick passed down through his family that he'd finally be willing to share with a stranger holding a camera. Instead, he told me about something he refuses to do, not a mistake he avoids by accident, the way most of us avoid things simply because we've never thought to try them. A rule he holds to on purpose, every single season, even when it would be easier and faster to break it, even when the people around him are doing the opposite without a second thought. Here's exactly what it is, and why 70 years of results have made him this stubborn about it. Let me set up the conversation properly, because the context is what makes his answer land. I'd asked him the question everyone asks a beekeeper who's been at it that long. What's your secret? He laughed at the word secret, the way people who've actually done something for decades tend to laugh at anyone looking for a shortcut. He said there isn't one thing he does that most experienced beekeepers don't also know about. What separates him, he said, isn't something he does, it's something he refuses to do consistently, even when every instinct and every bit of social pressure from other beekeepers pushes him toward doing it. He refuses to treat his hives for mites on a calendar, not he treats less often, not he prefers natural methods. He refuses, flatly, to apply a mite treatment to a colony simply because it's a certain time of year, or because that's what the beekeeping calendar app on his phone told him to do, or because everyone else in his local club is treating that week. He treats a colony for mites for exactly one reason, because he counted the mites in that specific colony and the number told him to. That's it. That's the whole rule. It sounds almost too simple to be the thing that's kept him from losing more than a handful of hives in 70 years of keeping bees. But the more he explained why, the more it became obvious this isn't a small habit. It's the difference between managing bees and managing a schedule. Here's the reasoning he walked me through, and it's worth taking seriously because it cuts against almost everything beginners are taught. Most beekeeping education, he said, teaches treatment by the calendar because it's simple to communicate and easy to follow. Treat in spring, treat again after the honey harvest, treat once more in late fall. It's a schedule anyone can follow without needing to learn how to actually read a colony, and for beginners overwhelmed with everything else they're learning, that simplicity has real value. He doesn't fault beginner education for teaching it that way, but he refuses to keep doing it that way himself, because he's watched what calendar-based treatment actually does over decades, and it isn't what people assume. The first problem is that a calendar doesn't know what's actually happening inside any specific hive. Two colonies sitting 3 feet apart in the same yard can have wildly different mite loads at the exact same point in the season, one nearly clean, one already dangerous, for reasons that have nothing to do with the calendar and everything to do with that colony's genetics, its brood pattern, whether it robbed out a weaker hive nearby or a dozen other variables. Treating both on the same calendar date means one colony gets medicated when it didn't need it, and the other might still be undertreated relative to how bad its actual problem is. The second problem, and the one he cares about more, is what happens to a colony that gets treated repeatedly, whether it needs it or not. He believes, and he's not alone among experienced beekeepers in believing this, that unnecessary treatment interferes with a colony's own ability to develop resistance over time. A colony that's never allowed to show you its actual mite load because it's treated preemptively before the number ever gets high enough to matter, never gets the chance to demonstrate whether it has any natural resistance at all. Over years, he said, calendar treating every colony equally means you can never tell which of your queens are actually worth breeding from, because you've masked the exact signal that would have told you. Quick word before I continue. Everything I've learned about testing instead of guessing, reading a colony instead of following a schedule, and the whole system built around this one rule, I gathered it all into the Hive Vault at daleshive.com. The link's in the description below and on the channel page if you want it. This video's free and always will be. The Vault's just the long version for folks who want the whole thing. I won't mention it again. I pushed back on him a little because his rule sounds risky on the surface, and I wanted to hear how he actually manages that risk rather than just accepting the philosophy at face value. He was clear that refusing to treat by the calendar does not mean refusing to treat. It means the trigger for treatment is always a number, never a date. He counts mites regularly, not once a season, but on a rolling basis through the parts of the year that matter most, particularly the pre-flow buildup and the critical window in late summer when the colony is raising the bees that have to survive winter. If a count comes back high, he treats immediately, without waiting for whatever the calendar says the normal treatment window is supposed to be. If a count comes back low, he doesn't treat, even if every other beekeeper he knows is treating that same week because it's the date they always do it. This is the part that took me a minute to fully understand. His refusal isn't laziness or an aversion to treating. If anything, it demands more of him than calendar treatment does, because it means doing the actual work of counting, every time, on every colony, rather than just applying the same product to every box on the same weekend and calling it done. Calendar treatment is the easy path. His way is the harder one, and he's chosen it deliberately for 70 years because he trusts the number over the date. He told me a specific number that stuck with me. The action threshold he uses, going into the critical late summer window when winter bees are being raised, is around 2 to 3 mites per 100 bees. Below that, he leaves the colony alone regardless of what the calendar says. At or above it, he treats immediately, regardless of what the calendar says. The number is the only thing that moves him. I asked him if this approach ever burned him, if refusing to treat by the calendar had ever cost him a hive he might have saved by just treating on schedule like everyone else. He was honest about it. He said early in his beekeeping life, before he'd fully committed to this discipline, he lost colonies the same way most beekeepers do, judging by how the hive looked rather than by an actual count, and either treating too late because nothing looked wrong yet, or not treating at all because he assumed a strong-looking hive was a safe one. It wasn't the refusal to calendar treat that caused those losses. It was not yet having replaced the calendar with something more reliable. Once he committed fully to testing rather than guessing, in either direction, testing instead of blind calendar treatment, and testing instead of blind assumption that a good-looking hive needed nothing, his losses dropped and largely stayed low for the rest of his career. He also said something I think is the real heart of this whole conversation. He said most beekeepers who get burned by treatment-free approaches aren't actually failing because they refuse to treat. They're failing because they've replaced treat on the calendar with never treat no matter what, which is just as blind as the calendar in the opposite direction. His rule isn't anti-treatment, it's anti-guessing. The calendar is a guess dressed up as a schedule, and refusing to treat at all is a guess dressed up as principle. The number is the only thing that isn't a guess. Here's what I've changed in my own beekeeping because of that conversation. Because I don't want this to just be a story about someone else's rule. I stopped treating on a fixed schedule the season after we talked. I count now, sugar roll or alcohol wash, sampled from the brood nest, on a rolling basis through spring buildup and again heading into the critical late summer window. Some colonies get treated in June because the number said to. Some don't get treated until September, or don't need treatment at all that year because the number never crossed the threshold. It is more work than circling a date on a calendar and treating every box the same weekend. It has also, in the time since, told me things about my own colonies I never would have known otherwise, which queens are actually holding mite counts down on their own, which colonies need real intervention every single time, and which ones are somewhere in between. Here are the mistakes people make trying to apply a version of this rule without understanding it fully. Mistake 1 is hearing he refuses to treat by the calendar, and concluding the lesson is to treat less, or to lean toward a treatment-free philosophy generally. The actual lesson is to replace the calendar with a count, which sometimes means treating more and more precisely than a calendar ever would. Mistake 2 is counting once and treating or not treating for the rest of the season based on that single number. Mite populations climb through the season, and a clean count in June tells you nothing reliable about August. The discipline is rolling counts, not one count that stands in for the whole year. Mistake 3 is judging colonies by comparison to each other rather than by their own number. Two hives side by side can have completely different mite situations. Treat the colony in front of you based on its own count, not based on what its neighbor needed. Mistake 4 is confusing this rule with an excuse to skip treatment because it feels more natural or less like work. If the number says treat, you treat immediately, regardless of any philosophical preference. The rule is precision, not avoidance. Picture running your own hives on this one refusal. No date circled on a calendar telling you when to treat every colony the same way, regardless of what's actually happening inside each box. Instead, a rolling habit of counting, a jar, some sugar or alcohol, 10 minutes, a real number, on every colony through the windows of the season that matter most. Some hives get treated early, some don't get treated at all that year. Every decision traces back to an actual measurement instead of a date on a page, and over years, that discipline tells you things about your own bees that blind, uniform treatment never could. He didn't give me a trick. He gave me a refusal, held to for 70 years, and the discipline behind it turned out to matter more than any single technique I've picked up since. Now you know what he refuses to do and why it's worked for longer than most of us have been alive. Drop a comment and tell me whether you treat by the calendar or by the count, and if this changes how you'll do it going forward. I read every single one at Dale's Hive. And if you want the full testing system laid out step by step, thresholds and timing included, it's waiting in the vault at daleshiv.com, link in the description. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're covering exactly how to run a rolling mite count schedule through the whole season so you always know the number instead of guessing the date. He refuses to treat by the calendar, only by the count. 70 years later, that refusal is still the whole reason it works.